The mistake that killed the gentleman's era, 1955 Le Mans. Pierre Levy never intended to become the catalyst for motorsport's darkest evolution. The 1955 Le Mans disaster began with something as simple as miscommunication between teammates, a moment of hesitation that would cascade into the deadliest accident in racing history. Mercedes had entered Le Mans with the revolutionary 300 SLR, a car so advanced it seemed untouchable, and Levy was their experienced anchor, the steady hand meant to guide them to victory. The plan was elegant in its simplicity, the kind of strategic precision that defined racing's gentleman era. But when Mike Hawthorne suddenly slowed his Jaguar in front of the Mercedes, Levy had nowhere to go. The split-second decision to swerve left instead of right sent his car airborne into the crowd, the magnesium body exploding like a bomb and killing 83 spectators in a shower of metal and fire. It wasn't mechanical failure or driver recklessness that caused the carnage. It was the simple human inability to predict another person's actions under pressure. The aftermath was swift and merciless. Mercedes withdrew from motorsport entirely. Switzerland banned circuit racing for decades, and the sport's governing body realized that gentlemen's agreements and honor codes weren't enough to prevent mass casualties. Racing would never again trust human judgment alone to keep death at bay. The age of innocence died with Pierre Levy buried beneath the weight of regulations that hadn't existed the morning before. When pride became poison, 1976 Nürburgring, Niki Lauda's mistake wasn't what he did on August 1st, 1976. It was what he failed to do in the days leading up to it. The Nürburgring had always been Formula One's most beautiful nightmare. 14 miles of elevation changes and blind corners that separated the truly great from the merely fast. Lauda knew the track was too dangerous for modern Formula One, had been vocal about its risks, and yet when the morning of the German Grand Prix arrived with rain beginning to fall, he made the decision that would define the rest of his life. He chose to race anyway, swayed by competitive pride and the unspoken pressure that admitting fear was career suicide. The crash happened exactly where everyone knew it would, at the most treacherous section of the most treacherous track in the world. Lauda's Ferrari slid wide, clipped the bank, and burst into flames with him trapped inside. The mistake wasn't the accident itself. It was racing at the Nürburgring when every instinct told him not to. Brett Lunger, Arturo Mazzario, Guy Edwards, and Harold Ertl risked their own lives to pull him from the wreckage, but the damage was already done. The aftermath transformed Lauda into racing's most compelling contradiction, a man whose near-death experience made him more calculating and fearless simultaneously. But more importantly, it marked the beginning of the end for tracks like the Nürburgring, circuits that demanded a level of acceptable risk the sport was no longer willing to pay. Formula One learned that day that even its greatest champions were mortal, and mortality was a luxury it could no longer afford. The corner that broke Brazil, 1994, Imola. Roland Ratzenberger's death should have been warning enough, but sometimes grief makes us double down on the very things that caused it. By the time Ayrton Senna climbed into his Williams for the 1994 San Marino Grand Prix, he was carrying the weight of a sport in crisis and a nation's expectations on his shoulders. The weekend had already been cursed with Ratzenberger's fatal crash during qualifying, and Senna had spent Saturday night tormented by doubts about whether racing should continue. The setup on his Williams was wrong, the car felt unstable, and every instinct he'd developed over a decade of racing told him something wasn't right. Yet when the moment came, he made the same choice Lauda had made 18 years earlier at the Nürburgring. The mistake wasn't in the driving, it was in the decision to drive at all. Tamburello Corner had claimed victims before, and the Williams FW16 had handling characteristics that even Senna couldn't fully master. When the steering column failed and sent him into the concrete barrier at nearly 200 miles per hour, the impact didn't just kill the greatest driver of his generation, it shattered Formula One's relationship with acceptable risk forever. Brazil mourned like a nation at war, 3 million people lining the streets of Sao Paulo for his funeral, and Formula One realized that losing Senna meant losing something irreplaceable about the sport itself. The FIA's response was immediate and total, a complete overhaul of safety regulations that would make the sport unrecognizable to previous generations. Senna's death didn't just end the era of deadly Formula One, it ended the era where drivers were expected to accept death as part of the job description. The phone call that poisoned a generation. 2008 Singapore, Pat Symonds made the call because he thought he was saving his team, not realizing he was about to destroy the credibility of an entire sport. The plan was breathtakingly simple in its cynicism. Nelson Piquet Jr. would crash his Renault at a predetermined point during the 2008 Singapore Grand Prix, bringing out the safety car at the exact moment needed to give teammate Fernando Alonso a strategic advantage. It was the kind of inside manipulation that fans had always suspected, but could never prove. The nightmare scenario that made every close race feel potentially tainted. Symonds, one of the sport's most respected engineers, convinced himself it was just aggressive strategy, the kind of gamesmanship that had always existed in the grey areas of competition. But when Piquet Jr. finally revealed the conspiracy a year later, the fallout went far beyond just Renault. Every dramatic safety car period, every convenient yellow flag, every close championship battle was suddenly viewed through the lens of potential manipulation. The sport's governing body handed down lifetime bans and massive fines, but the real damage was to Formula One's relationship with its own authenticity. Fans had always accepted that teams would bend rules and exploit loopholes, but deliberately causing crashes crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The conspiracy revealed that the people trusted to ensure fair competition were willing to risk driver safety for competitive advantage, turning every subsequent close finish into an exercise in paranoia. Formula One's innocence had been shattered before, but Singapore 2008 was the first time the sport had to confront the possibility that its own stewards might be the enemy. The algorithm that forgot to be human. 2021 Abu Dhabi. Michael Massey's mistake wasn't malicious or corrupt. It was something far more dangerous in modern Formula One. It was improvised. The 2021 Abu Dhabi Grand Prix had delivered everything the sport could have asked for. Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen entered the final race tied on points, the culmination of a season-long battle that had captured global attention and elevated Formula One to new heights of popularity. When Nicholas Latifi crashed his Williams with 5 laps remaining, Hamilton was cruising to his 8th championship. But the safety car period that followed created an impossible decision for race director Michael Massey. The regulations were clear but contradictory, allowing him to either end the race under caution or restart it with lapped cars still between the leaders. Massey chose a third option that existed nowhere in the rulebook, allowing only the cars between Hamilton and Verstappen to unlap themselves while keeping the others in position. The decision gave Verstappen fresh tyres and a clear run at Hamilton, setting up the dramatic final lap that would decide the championship. But the cost of that drama was Formula One's relationship with its own rules, the unspoken agreement that competitions are decided by predetermined regulations rather than real-time entertainment value. The aftermath consumed the sport for months, with Mercedes pursuing legal challenges and Hamilton disappearing from public view entirely. Massey was quietly removed from his position, and the FIA implemented new procedures designed to prevent any single person from having such influence over championship outcomes. But the damage was already done. The sport forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that its pursuit of entertainment had finally overwhelmed its commitment to fairness. The miscalculation that humbled champions. 2005 Indianapolis. Max Mosley thought he was protecting Formula One's future, but instead, he created its most embarrassing spectacle. The 2005 United States Grand Prix at Indianapolis Motor Speedway was supposed to be Formula One's triumphant return to American soil after a 5-year absence. The sport's chance to prove it belonged alongside NASCAR and IndyCar in the American racing landscape. The FIA had spent years courting American audiences, and Indianapolis represented everything F1 needed to succeed in the world's largest motorsports market. Then Ralf Schumacher's Toyota suffered a tyre failure during Friday practice, followed by similar failures that raised questions about Michelin's ability to safely complete race distance on the Indianapolis banking. But instead of finding a compromise that would allow all 20 cars to race safely, the FIA and Michelin engaged in a bureaucratic standoff that prioritized political positioning over sporting spectacle. When race day arrived, 14 cars pulled into the pits after the formation lap, leaving only the 6 Bridgestone-equipped cars to contest what became a 3-lap procession rather than a race. The crowd of over 100,000 American fans, many experiencing Formula One for the first time, watched in bewilderment as their expensive tickets became worthless and the sport they'd been told to embrace made a mockery of itself. The aftermath was immediate and devastating for Formula One's American ambitions. The United States Grand Prix was removed from the calendar, American television audiences evaporated, and an entire generation of potential fans learned that Formula One was a sport that would rather stage a farce than admit its mistakes. It would take over a decade, and the rise of Netflix's Drive to Survive to repair the damage done in those 3 meaningless laps around Indianapolis. Formula One discovered that day that protecting your pride sometimes costs you everything else that matters. The grid walk that broke the fourth wall, 2009 Hungary. Felipe Massa's accident wasn't caused by mechanical failure or driver error. It was caused by something far more mundane and terrifying: bad timing. The 2009 Hungarian Grand Prix was shaping up to be another routine victory for Jenson Button's championship campaign when a piece of debris from Rubens Barrichello's Brawn fell onto the track during Saturday qualifying. Under normal circumstances, the spring would have been cleared by marshals or avoided by drivers, but Felipe Massa was approaching at 160 miles per hour when it bounced directly into his visor. The impact was so violent it knocked him unconscious, while his Ferrari continued at racing speed toward the tyre barrier, a scenario that revealed Formula One's fundamental vulnerability to random chance. The spring weighed less than 2 pounds, a tiny component that had worked loose from Barrichello's car, but it struck Massa with the force of a bullet and fractured his skull in 3 places. The accident wasn't the result of pushing limits or taking risks. It was pure mechanical lottery, the kind of freak occurrence that no amount of safety regulation could completely prevent. When Massa's Ferrari hit the barrier at nearly unabated speed, the sport realized that even unconscious drivers could survive impacts that would have been fatal just years earlier. Massa's recovery took 8 months and cost him what might have been a world championship. But his survival proved that Formula One's safety evolution had reached a point where drivers could live through accidents that defied every instinct about human fragility. The incident led to reinforced visors and improved debris clearing procedures, but it also reminded everyone that sometimes the most dangerous moments in racing come from places no one is looking. Sometimes the thing that nearly kills you weighs less than a bag of sugar and falls from a clear blue sky. The tyre that rewrote the rulebook, 2013 British Grand Prix. Pirelli created the 2013 tyre compounds to generate excitement, but excitement in Formula One sometimes comes with consequences no one anticipated. The 2013 British Grand Prix weekend began with Lewis Hamilton's Mercedes showing pace that suggested a breakthrough was finally coming for the struggling team. But by Saturday evening, the paddock was consumed by a crisis that threatened to tear the sport apart. Pirelli's deliberately fragile tyre compounds, designed to create strategic uncertainty and multiple pit stops, had begun failing catastrophically rather than degrading gradually. When Felipe Massa's Ferrari suffered a rear tyre explosion at nearly 200 miles per hour, followed by similar failures for Jean-Eric Vergne and Sergio Perez, the sport faced the possibility that its quest for artificial entertainment had made racing genuinely dangerous. The failures weren't gradual degradation or strategic gambles gone wrong. They were sudden delaminations that sent chunks of rubber flying through the air and left drivers fighting for control at racing speeds. By Sunday morning, every team was demanding answers from Pirelli, while the tyre manufacturer struggled to explain how compounds that had tested successfully in laboratories were disintegrating under race conditions. The race proceeded with emergency tyre pressure increases and restricted camber settings, but the damage to Pirelli's reputation and Formula One's credibility was already done. The aftermath saw Pirelli completely redesign their compounds for the remainder of the 2013 season and fundamentally rethink their approach to tyre strategy. More importantly, it marked the end of Formula One's experiment with deliberately fragile components, the sport's acknowledgement that some forms of unpredictability were too dangerous to manufacture artificially. The quest for excitement had nearly killed the drivers who were supposed to provide it. and Formula One learned that entertainment value should never come at the cost of basic safety. The radio message that exposed the machine, 2016 Monaco. Nico Rosberg's victory at Monaco in 2016 should have been a triumph, but instead it became the moment Formula One accidentally revealed how much of modern racing happens in software rather than steering wheels. The 2016 Monaco Grand Prix was unfolding as a strategic masterclass for Mercedes when Lewis Hamilton's engine entered a recovery mode that reduced his power and threatened to hand the race to his teammate. Hamilton's engineer immediately began transmitting detailed instructions about how to manipulate the car's energy recovery systems, walking him through a complex sequence of button presses and mode changes that would restore full power. The radio coaching worked perfectly, allowing Hamilton to maintain his position and secure a podium finish, but it also exposed how dependent modern Formula One had become on constant communication between drivers and engineers. The incident sparked a fierce debate about whether drivers were actually driving or simply following instructions from engineers who had access to thousands of data points in real time. Max Verstappen famously complained that the sport was becoming more like remote-controlled cars than actual racing, and many fans agreed that the constant radio chatter was removing skill and instinct from driving. The FIA responded by implementing radio restrictions that limited the type of coaching drivers could receive, but the damage to Formula One's perception as a pure driving contest was already done. The aftermath revealed a fundamental tension in modern Formula One between technological advancement and sporting authenticity. Teams had spent decades perfecting their ability to manage races from the pit wall, and suddenly the sport's governing body was asking them to step back and trust drivers to figure things out themselves. The radio restrictions were eventually relaxed, but the Monaco incident had already shown fans how much of what they thought was driver skill was actually engineering expertise transmitted over the airwaves. Formula One learned that sometimes pulling back the curtain reveals more machinery than magic, and not every fan wants to see how the sausage is made. The algorithm that killed the underdog. 2014 Power Unit Revolution. The 2014 regulation change was supposed to make Formula One more relevant to road cars, but instead it created the most lopsided championship in the sport's modern era. The introduction of hybrid power units was Formula One's attempt to align itself with automotive industry trends toward electrification and efficiency, a noble goal that promised to make the sport more sustainable while maintaining its technological edge. The regulations were complex by design, requiring teams to master not just traditional engine development, but also energy recovery systems that could provide an additional 160 horsepower per lap through sophisticated software management. Mercedes had invested early and heavily in the new technology, while other manufacturers approached the regulations with varying degrees of commitment and understanding. But when the 2014 season began, it immediately became clear that Mercedes hadn't just gained an advantage, they had achieved technological dominance so complete it rendered competition nearly meaningless. Their power unit was producing significantly more power while consuming less fuel than their competitors, a combination that made every other team's chassis development irrelevant. Lewis Hamilton and Nico Rosberg won 16 of the first 19 races, and the championship became a Mercedes internal battle, while Red Bull, Ferrari and McLaren struggled with power units that were sometimes seconds per lap slower. The aftermath lasted for years, with Mercedes winning 8 consecutive Constructors' Championships and turning Formula One into a showcase for one manufacturer's engineering superiority. Other engine suppliers gradually closed the gap, but the damage to competitive balance took nearly a decade to fully repair. The sport learned that revolutionary technical regulations, no matter how well-intentioned, always risk creating eras of dominance that test even the most dedicated fans' patience. Sometimes progress means watching the same team win for so long that you forget what actual competition looks like. The weight limit that starved champions, 1988 and 1994 era. The FIA thought minimum weight limits would level the playing field, but instead they created a generation of drivers who treated their bodies like disposable components. The late 1980s and early 1990s saw Formula One cars becoming increasingly sophisticated, with electronic systems and safety equipment adding weight that teams desperately wanted to remove from other areas. The minimum weight regulations were intended to prevent teams from building dangerously light cars, but they also created an incentive structure where every pound mattered and drivers became the most expendable variable in the weight equation. Smaller drivers like Ivan Capelli and Andrea De Casaris gained opportunities not because of their skill behind the wheel, but because they could fit into cockpits designed around weight distribution rather than human comfort. But the real victims were the talented drivers who found themselves literally starving for seats, forced to maintain body weights that were unhealthily low to remain competitive in a sport that had always rewarded physical courage over physical deprivation. Nigel Mansell, despite being one of the era's most successful drivers, constantly battled weight restrictions that forced him to dehydrate before races and maintain a body weight that left him weakened and vulnerable. The problem became so severe that some drivers began using dangerous methods to shed pounds, turning Formula One cockpits into mobile torture chambers where success meant ignoring every signal your body sent about basic survival needs. The aftermath saw gradual increases in minimum weight limits and eventually the inclusion of driver weight in the calculations. But an entire generation of drivers had already paid the price for regulations that treated human beings as ballast to be minimized. The sport learned that safety regulations could create their own forms of danger when they failed to account for the lengths competitors would go to find advantages. Formula One discovered that sometimes protecting drivers from one type of harm just forces them to inflict different types of harm on themselves.